The air in the village square was thick with the scent of damp straw and nervous sweat. It was a grey morning in 1342, somewhere in the heart of England's West Midlands, and the crowd had gathered like moths to a grim flame. They weren't here for a market or a festival. No, today was a day of justice, or so the local lord called it. The cobblestones were slick with early rain, and the wooden platform at the center of the square creaked under the weight of something sinister. A man, his face pale as the moon, stood bound in chains, his eyes darting to the contraption beside him. A wooden frame with ropes and pulleys, its timbers stained dark from years of use. The rack, the crowd murmured, some with fear, others with a twisted excitement. This was the Middle Ages, and justice was a spectacle. Thomas, a blacksmith's apprentice, with calloused hands and a curious mind, stood at the edge of the crowd, his stomach churning. He'd seen punishments before, floggings, brandings, even a hanging last summer. But this was different. The man on the platform, a wiry fellow named Godwin, was accused of stealing from the church. Not just any theft, mind you, but a silver chalice from the altar, a crime that carried the weight of both sin and treason. The priest had demanded a confession, and the Lord had agreed. Godwin would face the rack until he spoke the truth. The executioner, a hulking man with a leather apron and a face like carved stone, stepped forward. "Godwin of Coventry," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "You stand accused of sacrilege. Confess, and the Lord may show mercy. Refuse, and the rack will loosen your tongue." The crowd leaned in, their breaths held. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. He'd heard stories of the rack, whispered in the tavern late at night how it could stretch a man until his joints popped like dry twigs, how some screamed for hours, how others never walked again. Was it as bad as they said? Worse? The executioner turned the crank, and the ropes tightened. Godwin's body jerked, his arms and legs pulled taut. A low groan escaped his lips, then a scream that made Thomas flinch. The crowd gasped, some crossing themselves, others gearing. "Confess," a woman shouted, her voice sharp with zeal. Thomas wanted to look away, but he couldn't. The rack was a machine of precision, designed not to kill quickly, but to prolong suffering. Each turn of the crank stretched Godwin's limbs further, the ropes creaking, his face contorting in agony. "I didn't steal it," he gasped, his voice ragged. "I swear by the Virgin." But the executioner didn't stop. Another turn, another scream. Thomas's hands clenched into fists. Was this justice, or just cruelty dressed up in holy robes? The Middle Ages were a time when fear ruled, from the towering castles of feudal lords to the candlelit halls of monasteries. Power was maintained through obedience, and obedience was enforced with pain. Torture wasn't just a punishment, it was a tool. Kings, lords, and the church all leaned on it to keep the masses in line. A stolen loaf of bread could cost you a hand. Questioning the church could cost you your soul. And in a world where trial by ordeal was as common as trial by jury, guilt was often decided by who could endure the most suffering. The rack, with its cold efficiency, was a favorite. It didn't just break but it broke spirits. Thomas had heard of men confessing to crimes they didn't commit, just to make the stretching stop. He wondered if Godwin would do the same. As the executioner paused, the priest stepped forward, his black robes billowing. "God sees your heart, Godwin. Speak the truth and save your soul." Godwin's chest heaved, his eyes wild with pain and defiance. "I take it," he whispered. The crowd hissed, impatient for a confession, hungry for the spectacle to continue. Thomas felt a pang of pity. He didn't know Godwin well, just a face from the market, a man who carved wooden spoons to sell on Sundays. But watching him writhe, Thomas couldn't help but think, what if that were me? The executioner cranked again, and Godwin's scream pierced the air. A sickening pop echoed his shoulder, maybe, or his hip. Thomas turned away, his stomach lurching. He pushed through the crowd, needing air, needing to escape the sound of suffering. As he stumbled toward the edge of the square, he heard the priest's voice rise. "God's will be done." The crowd roared in approval, but Thomas felt only dread. This was the Middle Ages, and this was justice. Later that evening, Thomas sat by the forge, the glow of the fire casting shadows on the walls. His master, Old Will, was hammering a horseshoe, the rhythmic clang a stark contrast to the screams still echoing in Thomas's mind. "You look pale," Ladwell said, not looking up. "The rack got to you, eh?" Thomas nodded, his throat tight. "How can they call that justice?" he asked. Godwin swore he was innocent. Will snorted, setting the hammer down. "Innocent or not, the rack don't care. It's not about truth, it's about fear. Keep the folk in line. Make M think twice before crossing the Lord or the church." Will leaned closer, his voice low. "You want to know the worst of it? The rack's just the start. They've got worse things in the dungeons." Thomas's eyes widened. "Worse?" Will nodded, his face grim. "I ever heard of the pair of anguish?" Thomas shook his head, and Will's voice dropped to a whisper, as if the very words were cursed. "It's a metal thing, shaped like a pear. They shove it in a man's mouth or worse places and turn a screw to make it open. tears you apart from the inside. Used it on heretics, they say, or them accused of unnatural sins. Thomas felt his skin crawl. Why would anyone make such a thing? He asked. Will shrugged. Power, lad. The church says it's to save souls, but it's about control. You scare folk enough, they'll confess to anything, even to being a witch or a heretic. Thomas thought of Godwin, his body broken on the rack, and imagined something even worse. The pair of anguish sounded like something from a nightmare, not a tool of justice. Do they still use it? He asked, dreading the answer. Will's eyes darkened. Not here, not yet, but in the cities, in the Inquisitions, dungeons? Aye, it's real. The conversation shifted to other devices, each more horrifying than the last. Will spoke of the Iron Maiden, a coffin-like box lined with spikes, though he admitted it was more legend than fact. They say it was used in Germany, he said, but I reckon it's a story to scare folk. Still, the idea is enough to make your blood run cold. Thomas imagined a man trapped inside, the spikes piercing slowly as the door closed. Whether real or not, the image lingered. Then Will mentioned the brazen bull, a device so monstrous it seemed impossible. A hollow bronze bull, he said, big enough to fit a man inside. They'd lock you in, light a fire underneath, and roast you alive. Your screams to come out through the bull's mouth, sounding like a beast roaring. Thomas stared, horrified. Who'd think of such a thing? Will chuckled darkly. Some mad tyrant, they say, back in ancient times. But the stories still float around, and I wouldn't put it past some lords to dream it up again. As the fire in the forge died down, Thomas's mind raced. The Middle Ages were a world of contrast cathedrals, reaching for the heavens, yet dungeons filled with horrors. The church preached mercy, but wielded tools of torment. Lords demanded loyalty, but ruled through fear. And the people, like Thomas, lived in the shadow of both. He thought of Godwin again, wondering if he'd confessed or if his body had given out first. Did it ever change anything? Thomas asked. All this torture didn't make the world better. Will sighed, his face etched with years of hard truths. Better. No. It kept things the same, kept the powerful in power, the poor in their place. But mark my words, lad folk don't forget. They whisper about the rack, the pear, the bull, they fear M, but they hate M too. One day, that hat'll spark something bigger than any lord's dungeon. Weeks passed, and Thomas couldn't shake the image of Godwin on the rack. The village had moved on another market, another sermon, but the memory clung to him like damp wool. He began to notice things he hadn't before. The way folk lowered their eyes when the Lord's men rode by. The way the priest's sermons carried a sharper edge, warning of heresy and disobedience. The Middle Ages weren't just about surviving the plague or the harvest. They were about surviving the system. And the system, Thomas realized, was built on pain. One chilly morning, a stranger arrived in the village. He was a wiry man with a scarred face and a cloak patched with years of travel. He called himself Elias, a wandering storyteller who'd seen the courts of London and the dungeons of Paris. The villagers gathered in the tavern that night, eager for his tales, and Thomas squeezed in near the fire, his curiosity burning. Elias's voice was low and gripping, his stories laced with the dark truths of the world beyond their village. Ever seen the Inquisition at work? Elias asked, his eyes glinting in the firelight. The crowd leaned in, and Thomas felt a chill. They don't just want your confession, Elias continued. They want your soul. They've got tools you can't imagine, devices to break a man's body and his spirit. He described the pair of anguish in gruesome detail, confirming Will's stories. They'd use it on anyone. They called a heretic, Elias said. A man speaks out against the church, pear in the mouth. A woman accused of witchcraft? Worse. The crowd gasped, and Thomas's stomach twisted. He imagined the metal petals opening, tearing flesh, silencing screams. Elias went on, his voice dropping to a whisper. Then there's the Iron Maiden, a coffin of spikes, built to pierce every inch of you, but slow. They say it's a myth, but I've heard of one in a German castle, used on rebels who dared defy their lord. Thomas glanced at Will, who raised an eyebrow. Myth or not, the idea was horrifying, a slow, deliberate death, designed to terrify onlookers as much as the victim. Elias paused, letting the image sink in, then grinned. Not the worst. The brazen bull. I heard of it in Sicily, a relic of ancient cruelty. They'd roast a man alive inside, and the crowd would cheer as his screams turned to a bull's roar. Even the church couldn't resist that kind of spectacle. The tavern was silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Thomas felt the weight of the stories, each one a reminder of the world he lived in. The Middle Ages weren't just about knights and quests. They were about survival in a system that crushed the weak. Elias's tales weren't just entertainment, they were warnings. Why did they do it? Thomas asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. Elias turned to him, his scarred face unreadable. Fear, he said simply. A scared man obeys, a scared village kneels, and a scared world stays quiet. That night, Thomas lay awake, his mind spinning. The rack, the pear, the Iron Maiden. The brazen bull, they weren't just tools, they were symbols. The church used them to root out heresy, the lords to enforce loyalty, the crowds to feel alive in a world of misery. But Elias's words echoed, "A scared world stays quiet." Thomas wondered if it could ever change. He thought of Godwin, broken on the rack, and of the countless others who'd faced similar fates. Were they all guilty, or were they just caught in a machine bigger than themselves? The next day, Thomas overheard whispers in the market. A group of villagers were talking about a rebellion in a nearby town. Peasants who'd had enough of taxes and torture, who'd burned a lord's manor and fled into the woods. The lord's men were hunting them, and the priest was preaching about the wages of sin. Thomas felt a spark of something dangerous. Hope. If people could fight back, maybe the world didn't have to stay this way. Maybe the rack and the pear and the bull weren't invincible. Years later, Thomas would tell his own stories. Not as a blacksmith, but as a wanderer like Elias. He'd speak of the Middle Ages not as a time of chivalry but as a time of shadows, where torture was a tool of power and fear was a currency. He'd describe the rack's creak, the pear's cruelty, the Iron Maiden's myth, and the brazen bull's horror. But he'd also tell of the whispers in the taverns, the rebels in the woods, the spark of defiance that refused to die. The Middle Ages were brutal, yes, but they were also a crucible, forging something new in the hearts of those who dared to dream of a world without fear. And as Thomas told these stories, he'd end with a question, just as Elias had. What would you do, faced with the rack or the bull? Would you confess, or would you fight? The crowd would fall silent, and Thomas would smile, knowing the answer lay not in the past but in the future they'd build together.